Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in particular, in the early 18th century and throughout the 18th century, were important in sort of driving the abolition movement. But as I said, it was so entrenched that people really didn't want to listen. And it's only in the 1780s, in fact, that we see the abolition movement really taking off in Britain.
Virtually the whole of this town was involved in the slave trade. Everyone was in it. And they fought to keep the slave trade for years and years and years. And you can see the advert, which was from a newspaper, I think the Liverpool Mercury. And interestingly there, Francis Gildart, who's mentioned in the newspaper article, he was of a slave-owning family as well. The whole town was involved in slavery. But they never mentioned it. It was never spoken about in polite society. What you referred to were African labourers. All these streets still exist in Liverpool, and they all have links with the slave trade. The Tarletons were slave traders, the Cunliffes were slave traders, the Earls were slave traders. Admiral Rodney was a supporter of the slave trade, although he was not involved in the trade himself. Newton was a slave ship captain who became a devout Christian. Penny Lane is probably named after James Penny or his family, another prominent slave trader. And Jamaica Street, of course, is named after Jamaica, a former British colony where many of the slaves were taken and where their descendants live today.
It isn't a white European movement. It isn't just about white Europeans. It's very much a movement by those that have been enslaved, by those that are still enslaved, working together to end slavery.
The first thing that really, I suppose, the important milestone is 1788. William Dolben puts a bill into Parliament which does get enacted, and this controls the number of slaves per tonne that can be held on a ship, and it also enforces surgeons. They say they have to take a ship's surgeon onto the slave ships. In fact, most ships had taken surgeons on beforehand because it sounds horrible now, but you want to keep your cargo alive, you can't sell a dead slave. So it was only perhaps so important in the changes it made to the slave trade, but it was certainly important, I think, as a momentous occasion in bringing the abolition movement to sort of fruition.
There's a movement, a common people movement. People from all walks of life were involved in the abolition movement, and yes, definitely there is very key people within the movement that are of African descent.
There were various arguments that came into play here. The first one is perhaps, because I've talked a lot about the economy, is economics. And really here the slave traders have the upper hand. Basically they said, look, the British government have encouraged us to invest in slave trade and slavery for many years. You've sanctioned it by Parliament, so this is a U-turn in policy. There's about 70 to 80 million pounds invested in the West Indies, about 30% of that in debts to do with the slave trade. All those manufacturers in Sheffield, Birmingham, Manchester, etc., are all going to be made unemployed if we're not involved in the slave trade, not just because of the barter itself on the African coast, because basically, and here they had to be honest, so many slaves died every year because the conditions were so awful that they needed this constant influx of slaves to survive. So basically they say, not only are you doing the U-turn on policy and that's unfair, but basically the whole Atlantic system that we are the leaders in is going to fall apart. Now, the abolitionists, you know, led by, say, especially Thomas Clarkson, for example, here, really didn't have such a good argument in this, because this is all pretty true. He goes around and nearly gets himself killed by talking to all the slave traders and sailors in Liverpool to get, you know, all the details. Basically what he argues is that, well, surely there's other things we can do. We can trade within Africa, except that, and especially the palm oil trade and gum, etc., hardwoods, etc. That this was something else we could trade in. William Wilberforce was an MP in the British Parliament. He led Parliament and, you know, sort of brought on abolition. The slaves in the Caribbean were finding out about the abolition movement. Both sides used this as well to further their argument. So the slave traders said, if we promote abolition further, they're going to keep rioting. And the abolitionists said, well, the fact that they're rioting shows that they're sort of sentient beings that know what they want, and they want freedom.
Give us free!
Most of the MPs were slave owners, slave traders. When they realised that slavery had to be abolished, they then altered the laws so that they got compensation for every slave that they had to give up. Compensation went into their pockets, not into the pockets of the slaves.
But I think this abolitionist movement becomes wrapped up in this idea of what the British state wants to be in the future, because there's lots of things happening in the East that mean that they want free trade, you know, they want to dominate, they want to get the new trade in Africa, maybe not on the slave trade, but also in India with the East. The Dutch are perhaps losing some of their power.
Very few. They ended up living and forming communities many, many miles from where they were from. And it's a very, very sad story. So, for instance, the British, the time it was a British island, well, today it's still a protectorate, it's St Helena in the Atlantic. Very, very small country, not off the coast of South America and in between South America and Africa. So it's a long way to get there. And that's where many of the enslaved Africans were basically left after they were rescued. And it's a long way from where they were from. So it puts it into perspective. Yes, it was positive that you had the Royal Navy Squadron, but equally it wasn't necessarily a happy ending for many of the people that were saved by this squadron.
But of course, what better way to dress it up than saying, you know, we are policing this brave new world, slavery must stop, it's evil, you know, you know. So, and in fact, this eventually comes in, there's an abolition slavery bill in 1833, so it's, you know, quite a while afterwards, that comes into force in 1834.
Obviously, Britain did not end slavery within the Caribbean and Americas until like 1833, 1838. You know, so there was a commitment to stop the slave trade, but a later commitment to stop slavery. So they weren't hand in hand. There was a longer movement.
Slaves aren't free, actually, in fact, till 1838. And in those 4 years, those planters are supposed to train the slaves for their new lives. Of course, they don't want to do that. They want to keep them only in the skills that they have for the plantations, so that under the new free market economy, the only work they can find is with the plantation owner.
Practically a continuation of slavery, really and truly. So, you know, once they gained freedom, they didn't get equality. They got freedom, but freedom is no use without the right to vote, the right to earn money, to have equality, to be treated equal. So, you know, that's a longer process. So, you know, these dates are significant, but at the same time, you know, they're not the ends of the stories. They're the starts of another story, another chapter, and like this history continued. And you could say it continues up to the present day.
You know, in many countries, let's take Brazil, you know, it was in 1888, I believe. Yeah, I mean, that's a long time. So there were still people in countries making a lot of money up until you know, the very latter parts of the 19th century.
My father was a working slave, just like me. You learn to keep your head down. Don't look to see what's going on all around you. All my life has been that way. And now the boss man cut my chains and he walk away.
There's a huge mass migration of slave, or ex-slaves, should I say, from 1838 onwards as they try to find their family. Even under the domestic slave trade there, families are split up, children are sold, you know, husband and wife are split up. The slaves move around to find their family. And also they want to use what skills they do have for their own purposes. What's also worth remembering is that whilst the British are busy celebrating themselves for the abolition of the slave trade and slavery in the Atlantic world, that various forms of slavery are actually still continuing in their Indian empire to the east.
Oh, now the boss man cut my chains and set me free.
And when it looked as if slavery was going to be abolished, the cotton workers of Yorkshire and Lancashire, they actually rioted. They thought, no slaves, no more cotton, no work for us, we are going to starve to death. But in fact, when slavery was abolished, free workers worked twice as hard. There was that much cotton coming into this country that the British government reduced the age so that white working class children as young as 4 and 5 years of age were put to work in the cotton mills alongside their parents of Yorkshire and Lancashire. Many of them children lost their fingers, lost their arms, lost their lives. No such thing as compensation for them. So here we have a situation in this country where free white working class men, women and children are being treated in a similar fashion as the freed slaves. Both groups of people are being treated as what I would call waged slaves. And if you look in the way in which multi-businesses move their businesses all around the world, nothing has changed. In the 1930s, early 1940s, there was many working class houses that had no electricity. And my mother used to send me and my sister was older than me, to the chandlers to buy the paraffin oil fuel for the lamps. And as we had to go to the shop, we had to pass groups of white working class men and boys standing on street corners. And as we would walk past, they would actually spit on their hands. And they would actually say, spit on your hands and rub on a nigger's head for luck. When we come out of the shop with the oil, those who hadn't done it would also do it. When we got home, our head and hair would be covered in spittle. My mother would be crying her eyes out as she was washing our heads. But my mother could not go and complain to the police. Earlier on, we'd been chased out of our house, not because we were behind with the rent. The rent was always paid, purely and simply because we were black. When you look at the way in which I was treated from the moment I was born, it would have been quite easy for me to become a member of Black Power and to want to be separate. But from my point of view, I want to be free. Freedom of choice. Choice in religion. Choice to go wherever I want. Why discriminate against anybody? I don't want anyone to discriminate against me, and therefore I'm not going to discriminate against anybody. But I want to be able to speak my views openly and fearlessly. And I want to be treated as a human being. Nothing more, nothing less. What changed a lot was the Second World War. Because all of a sudden, regardless of whether you were black or white, once you were born here, you were a brother. Once you put the uniform on, lot of black people, their sons, were involved in the wars. In many cases, whole black male lines and families were wiped out because of the colour bar, the racism. The only job they could get was as seamen, merchant seamen on the ships. And in many cases, not only was the father on board the ship, but the grandfather, the sons, maybe 6 or 7 males in one family. So when that ship was torpedoed, all them men died at sea. And if you do get in the army, you put in what the pioneer calls. In other words, you're the lowest ranks and you're doing the lowest jobs. You're a coup. I was fortunate that I was in the Royal Artillery. And in the Royal Artillery, I was a driver. As regards authority, you may be lucky if you reach the rank of a captain. You're extremely lucky if you reach the rank of a major. When it comes to jobs, yeah, we're still not treated as full equals as we should be. It's hard to put your finger on it or to explain it. One of the ways in which ordinary people can see it there is to start to ask the question, how many black people do you see working alongside you? How many black men or women are in positions of power? This is the problem. But if you go into the establishment, the banks, the businesses, the universities, you will very rarely find directors, men and women, in high positions within them organizations. To my way of thinking, a multiracial city is where you see people of different nationalities all the way through, from the person on the door, from the person behind the desk, even to the directorship.
So obviously there is a slave trade today, of course there is. It's often underground. And we try to campaign to show that there is different forms of slavery.
It's a slavery environment. It's not chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is what Liverpool merchants were involved in, and that was buying and selling human beings. Today, it's much more insidious. It's not spoken about. It's about master and servant.
Whether that be forced marriage, child labour, sexual exploitation.
And for example, in some countries like Mauritania, in North Africa, there's an estimated 600,000 of such people who are absolutely beholden to their masters, as they call them, and cannot leave their homes, cannot go away, cannot have an independent life. And that's the face, or one face, of modern-day slavery. The ankle bracelets are worn in that particular part of Africa, as which is Niger, as an emblem of slavery. You're forced to wear these, and strangely they strongly resemble the manillas that were traded for slaves in the 18th century. More than a coincidence. People trafficking, it's another form of slavery which seems to have grown in recent years, in which particularly people who come from poorer parts of Europe are promised a better life, and they end up with such things as prostitution and crime.
Anti-Slavery International and the International Labour Organization set a motion in place at the United Nations to actually outlaw different forms of domestic slavery.
There are many, many famous faces here, including Bishop Tutu, Bob Marley, Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, Kofi Annan, Trevor MacDonald, Nelson Mandela, and others as well. Some who are less well known, but who of course really set great examples for fellow black people at the time when there was it was a very different world indeed. So the Black Achievers Wall really commemorates that achievement. And this is what we call the Freedom Wall, which is covered with quotations from various people involved, either at the time of the slave trade or in modern times, on what slavery means to them.
As regards Liverpool, Liverpool's got a long way to go as regards being a multiracial city. They're constantly talking about it and calling it a multiracial city, but time and time again I can prove without a shadow of a doubt that when you really look deeply, you find that it's far from being a multiracial city. We've got a long way to go. And when you stop and think about it, the number of years that we've been in this country, you would think that by this time in life, we would all have true equality. But unfortunately, this is not the case. We're not asking for more, we're asking for equal shares in the prosperity of life. That means when everything's hard, it's hard for everybody. When everything's great, it's great for everybody.